Africa's climate is changing, and with El Nino already sweeping through parts of the continent, many nations are bracing themselves. But over and above the weather, climate change is proving to be most detrimental to farmers, with both rising temperatures and unpredictable rainfall putting food security at risk on a continent expected to double its population by 2050. So how can this risk be mitigated? And what more can be done to counter Africa's changing climate? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, global temperatures have been rising in the past 100 years. And as this graph here shows us, projections into 2020 indicate a continuation of this trend. While scientists have blamed this phenomenon on climate change, which can be traced back to 19th century Europe during the Industrial Revolution. So what's this got to do with Africa exactly? Well, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, by 2020, between 75 and 250 million people in Africa are projected to be exposed to increased water stress due to global warming. By 2020, in some countries, yields from rain-fed agriculture could be reduced by up to 50%. Agricultural production, including access to food in many African countries, is projected to be severely compromised. And towards the end of the 21st century, a projected sea level rise will affect low-lying coastal areas with large populations. By 2080, an increase of 5 to 8% of arid and semi-arid land in Africa is projected under a range of climate scenarios. So why is Africa bearing the brunt of climate change, a phenomenon it's hardly responsible for? And what does this mean for the continent's food security? In the meantime, though, in preparation for El Nino's visit to Africa, Ethiopia has been ramping up efforts to avoid a disaster. The country has already been suffering from a prolonged drought, with more than 8 million people dependent on food aid. CCTV's Girum Chala tells us more.
Ethiopia's drought has been a long one. In August, 4.5 million people needed assistance. That is now nearly doubled. But government says the crisis remains under control.
The government was able to, of course with the support of partners, was able to provide both fodder and food to many affected areas. But the problem continues to grow because the effects of El Nino are not just a one-season effect.
The extreme weather patterns brought on by El Nino are affecting other countries in the region. Ethiopia relies heavily on agriculture, so the drought has hit hard.
So far we have allocated about $200 million to purchase emergency food, mostly from local sources and of course from international sources as well. You don't have to be the poorest country in the world, you don't have to be the wealthiest country in the world or whatever. All it requires is that, because such emergency situations call for reconfiguration of one's financial plans, if you will, expenditures, if you will.
The government has put in place measures to avoid catastrophe, like the famine in 1984.
Ethiopia today is not Ethiopia of 1984, and of course the government is capable of preventing the kind of colossal famine some naysayers are predicting will happen.
So the Ethiopian government says it's well prepared for disaster, but this is a case of funding too. Aid agencies say the country needs nearly $600 million to save people and livestock. Grumtala CCTV, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Now, the World Bank says that by 2030, droughts and heat will leave 40% of sub-Saharan Africa's maize-growing land unable to support the crop, while rising temperatures could cause major loss of savanna grasslands, threatening pastoral livelihoods. CCTV's Lindim Tongana spoke to the spokesperson of the World Agroforestry Center, Dr. Sami Kassan, to find out more about the impact of climate change in Africa's agricultural sector.
The current food situation in Africa could be said to be dire if you looked at key elements of climate change, and one of the key concerns around climate change is increasing temperatures. And we look at temperatures to be really a key factor that will affect or damage African agriculture. What we see is with increasing temperatures in Africa is issues of water. And most of our African agriculture is rain-fed. So definitely this affects production of agriculture, and yields then are actually declining in most of Africa. As you may have learned from the past agricultural revolution, Africa was widely bypassed by the revolution. If you compare Africa to Asia and Latin America, for instance, production in agriculture has been relatively low.
Now, as you say, some of these impacts that you're seeing, of course, are having quite a serious effect on agricultural production. Just maybe go further for us into that as far as how far-reaching and perhaps immediate some of these impacts are, as well as to what extent they expose Africa's vulnerability.
Yeah, we see a situation where particularly we are talking about malnourishment in children, and also we see huge populations going into hungry situations. So current estimates is 235 million people go hungry, and these are really huge numbers. We've seen, of course, in the past years, in the 2007s, even food droughts, happening in parts of Africa. We've seen, wheat production, for instance, reducing significantly, and the temperature range for crops like wheat is, for instance, very, very, very narrow. You have a 15 to 20 degrees, range of temperature. So any changes in this would mean a reduction in wheat production, and this is really key concerns. And we're looking at 30-year period, and you could have a loss of yield production in all the major staple crops. You're looking at wheat, you're looking at maize. Then you're also looking at the traditional crops like millet and sorghum, which you could actually end up losing productivity.
Now, Africa's survival seems to depend quite strongly on the continent's ability to adapt. Is there support for Africa's resilience against climate change?
There has been quite some effort at continental level. I think we have the NEPAD that has put quite some wide measures to support African agriculture. And I think African governments now are turning around to indeed look at more seriously the impacts of climate change, and especially to yield issues, in agriculture. So there are concerted efforts to help in turning around productivity, but still a lot needs to be done, particularly if you look at the policy environment for agriculture and environment, because these then go together. If we say that African agriculture actually is anchored on, having a sustainable natural environment, and also us maintaining, the biodiversity resources we have, then the policy environment and the support, to the research and to the extension that would actually help, anchor agriculture then becomes very critical. So there are certain measures that have been taken, and if you look at the CGR centers where I'm coming from, the CGR centers have been on the forefront in doing several things. We particularly have, a collection of genetic resources, wide genetic resources collections that are diverse in nature. So these are really a resource that are suitable, particularly for changing weather conditions, and this can be used, of course, in different extreme conditions.
Now, you mentioned a little earlier that when it comes to adaptation techniques and as well as supporting Africa's resilience, it comes down to leadership. Are you suggesting that the political will and leadership is there to see improvements in this area or across the continent?
I think with the kind of crisis that we've seen and we've witnessed in the past, the political will is changing, and I think the will is really to improve on production. We've always seen that there's under investment in agriculture by government, even for governments that have the highest GDP earnings from agriculture itself. Low investment in research and development, low investment in extension, but with the recent crisis in food shortages, that is really rampant, and that is also can be a source of conflict, then governments are actually being forced to look into this issue more seriously. But Africa also has the most increasing population rates across the world. We have the highest rates of population increase across the world if you compare to other places. But also the place with that agriculture can have the highest impact in terms of livelihood contribution. So we're saying, just simple investment in agriculture results in a huge impact on livelihood for rural communities in Africa.
And when we look ahead to the upcoming climate talks in Paris, would you say that African leadership speaks with one voice from a common position?
Yeah, certainly the probably need to speak with one voice. Of course, Africa is diverse. If you look all the way from North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and production systems are different. So, but certainly in terms of the investment in agriculture and in terms of investment on climate mitigation, I think there's need to come up and speak with one voice on what areas that we need to focus on more closely.
And what are the key recommendations that African countries need to put forward to delegates at the upcoming climate talks in Paris?
Yeah, I think particularly is the input systems. We realize and we see that African production system, if you look at agricultural input system, and fertilizer is key. Fertilizer input in Africa are the most expensive. So we need probably fair systems in terms of inputs that's affordable to our farmers, that are also climate sensitive to our farmers. We need to look at the issues of water scarcity and more investments going into the water issues. We need to look at issues of livestock production system. If you look at the Horn of Africa, with every other drought season, you have catastrophe in terms of livestock losses. And we need to look at what are these issues causing. But at the same time, we see a wide range degradation of the areas that and the resources that these communities use as feeds for the animals. So what we're suggesting also with the work we do is that there are feed resources, and particularly tree-based resources. Because I'm coming from an agroforestry center, we look at tree-based resources that can be used to indeed complement the livestock sector feed resources. So and we're seeing an opportunity here then, to tap into these resources, harvest them more, and create the awareness and the education that is needed to conserve them and to utilize them in a more sustainable way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kassim.
Thank you very much, Neri.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guests will give their predictions on how best to combat Africa's changing climate. To stay with us.
To build a sound ecology is vital for mankind's future. All members of the international community should work together to build a sound environment. We should respect nature, follow nature's ways, and protect nature. We should firmly pursue green, low-carbon, circular, and sustainable development. China will shoulder its share of responsibility in this common endeavor. We also urge developed countries to fulfill their historic responsibility, honor their emission reduction commitments, and help developing countries adapt to climate change.
That was Chinese President Xi Jinping reiterating the country's commitment to combat climate change at the UN General Assembly last month. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to help me make sense of Africa's changing climate, I have expert guests standing by. In Nairobi, Dr. Richard Munang, the UNEP Africa Regional Coordinator on Climate Change. In Johannesburg, Steve Collins, Biodiversity Activities Manager at the USAID Resilience in the Limpopo River Basin Program. And in Beijing, Professor Ho Wenping, Research Fellow at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies. To you all, thank you for joining in this discussion. Dr. Munang, to you first. Let's start with the current situation here. We've seen drought since 2011, 2013 in the Horn of Africa region, in the Sahel region. African governments have been told there is El Nino weather patterns coming along. What is the situation exactly?
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for having me in studio. We are actually 15 years into the 21st century, and the continent of Africa has been faced with a variety of shocks and challenges which are unprecedented in scale and nature. And one of these is climate change, which is already reshaping the contours of the entire African continent today. And as you rightly mentioned, in 2011, the Horn of Africa suffered the worst drought, and in 2012, the Sahel, and now we have recurring El Ninos, which are popping up. And this is have been reiterated in the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which came out last year, stating very clearly that severity of extreme events like drought are going to become very, very prominent. And this was re-echoed by the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report for Africa this year, stating the same. So where we are today is the changing climate is no longer an abstract issue. And it is crystal clear, and these impacts that have been demonstrated through the droughts that happen in the Horn of Africa, as I stated, and in the Sahel, are a reality, and so something needs to be done about that.
Something needs to be done about this. Steve, you're on the ground there along the Limpopo River, though. What is your experience? How are communities dealing with this?
Well, the communities are really struggling, to be honest. We are starting to experience drought in this area now as well. And communities are trying to find ways in which they can deal with less water and less reliable water. Some of them are developing ways of farming which moves away from high irrigation schemes more towards conservation type of agriculture where you use less water. Some of them are looking at different kinds of livestock to deal with the fact that, for example, a lot of cattle can't deal with droughts, but wildlife can. So maybe we should start farming wildlife rather than cattle, which can deal with this kind of these implications of long droughts and then flash floods.
Well, Professor Ho, I want to draw in from the experience of China here, which has some experience in dealing with adverse weather conditions. What's been China's experience in dealing with adverse weather conditions?
I think the global warming issue is a global challenge to all the countries in this planet. So from the perspective of China, I think first of all, Chinese government has paid increasing attention to this issue. For example, I remember like years ago, the government has issued a white paper on dealing with climate change and also global warming. And all those policies has been implemented. For example, now the economic readjustment now is ongoing. That is, we no longer like chasing this speedy economic growth rate, but now it's focused on how to readjustment this structure. That is, those like a lot of energy consuming industry, they have to be make a rearrangement of their energy to use, the fuel, those fossil resources. From the grassroots level, people like living in the rural area,
right.
Maybe they are burning like the trees, those waste of the green things. So now they need to change the way they used to be. So those education is also very important.
So I come back, though, Dr. Munang, though, I come back to your earlier issue of the changing climate is no longer abstract and that governments now know exactly what is going on. So in terms of Africa, though, what are governments doing exactly?
I think that is a very valid question. I think that the African continent, if you look at what governments are doing, the African government have a very consolidated position which have been used by the African group of negotiators to actually foster Africa's position, which has been adaptation is priority for the African continent, and at the same time finance is a priority, as well as technology transfer and capacity development. So if you look at what the governments have been doing is they have been trying to put in place resilient development, and most of these resilient development has been in areas of agriculture and water and also energy. But this is something that is happening, but it's a process with no definitive endpoint, and there are still a lot of resources that are actually needed by the entire African continent to be able to adapt to climate change. So there is still a lot that needs to be done to be able to build the resilience of the African continent.
Steve, there's still a lot to be done, though. You're dealing with about 18 million people around the Limpopo River, though. Are you seeing the governments in those countries doing the right thing to mitigate or assist the communities in adapting?
I think, to be honest, we've got a bit of a way to go as African countries as well. We need to start talking to each other a lot more across our boundaries, not just to the west or to the east. I think one of the key things we're dealing with is trans-boundary management of a water resource. Water is the center of everything. It feeds your environment, it feeds your agriculture, it feeds your people. If you don't manage the water resource, and climate change is going to impact, that's going to be one of the big things you're going to see. It's going to be on water. They need to start talking to each other a lot more seriously and a lot more honestly about who can use that resource and how it's managed for all the countries, not just for one country's own development. So I think we do have policies in place. I think we have good intentions, but I think often on the ground, that discussion between countries is not a fair one, and it's not a constructive one.
Right. Dr. Munang, you did talk about funding there, and of course, that is a rather sensitive issue now as global leaders look for that pledge of $100 billion. But the Chinese pledge of $3.1 billion, though, as you talk about adaptation, where should that money be concentrating on?
Yeah, thank you very much, Beatrice. The continent of Africa is still based on the impacts of climate change, as has been shown by different assessment reports, especially the Africa Adaptation Gap report shows that the agricultural sector, which employs up to about 65% of the labor force in the continent and contributes 32% to the GDP, is going to be affected up to 40%. So there will be crop reduction or crop failure up to about 40%. So to be able to build the adaptive capacity of most of the vulnerable people who are women, and at the same time those in the rural areas, adaptation costs, most of it should get into agriculture, which is the area that not only underpin economies, but at the same time provide sustainable livelihood for more than 80% of people who live in rural area, and the continent of Africa have up to about 70% of its people rural.
All right. Professor Hoenping, though, does China have a role to play here, though?
Of course, I think in terms of food security, China not only offer the help to Africa, like in terms of financial support or technical know-how. I think most importantly, I think the experience for developing agricultural industry also is highly relevant for African to resolve this food security. In China, the #1 official document every year normally goes to the agricultural issue. So 3 elements has been put high folks priority. One is agriculture, another is a rural area, another is farmer. So those 3 things actually they are linking with each other. So agricultural industry, they need the farmers to play their role, and also the village, that's the place those farmers live in. So you have to develop the modern village, the modern rural area, and then to motivate those farmers, their enthusiasm to develop their own homeland and also develop their agricultural township industry. So all of those 3 things, you cannot cut them separately. So that's the thing. That is the holistic thinking about how to develop those agricultural industry, how to generate more food products like rice in China. So those experience I think we can offer for African countries to take some references.
Dr. Munang, though, we keep hearing about climate change talks and ways to mitigate, ways to adapt for developing countries, expectations from the developed countries. Climate talks are coming up in Paris. Does Africa, though, have a common position? What is it that Africa would want to see?
Yeah, thanks again, Beatrice. The African common position, as was endorsed again by the African Ministerial Conference during their March meeting this year in Cairo, Egypt, unequivocally stated adaptation is a priority for Africa, and the parity between adaptation and mitigation must be enhanced as the continent gets into these negotiations. But finance is one of the areas that, though most of the time have proven contentious, is still going to be quite very, very important, especially in COP21 in Paris in a couple of weeks from today. But at the same time, technology transfer and capacity development, these are elements that constitute the African position. But overarchingly, the continent of Africa is also looking at alternatives that can, in as much as these negotiations are ongoing, it's also empowering their communities in their country through different approaches, though these approaches are not at scale, but to make this become the norm, there is need to be finances. For example, like ecosystem-based adaptation approaches. Like Steve mentioned, UNEP in collaboration with the African Union in July actually created what is called the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation for Food Security Assembly. And as Professor indicated, to bridge policy and action at the same time is what has been a problem in Africa. So bringing everyone on board, civil societies, NGOs, international organizations, individual citizens, and at the same time academia, educators, bringing them all together can be able to address most of these problems. But I think the elephant in the room, as we discuss all these elements, is the youth bulge in the African continent today. We have the youth population currently at 200 million and projected to reach 400 million in less than 15 years from today. But the same youthful population between the ages of 15 to 20 are at 60% unemployment today. So how will jobs be created under the changing climate is actually what needs to be the driving force forward in looking at how do we utilize the opportunities that climate change also presents.
Okay, Steve, I'm going to get a final comment from you, though, because you work with communities on the ground. In upcoming talks on climate change, though, what should African governments be focusing on?
I think they should be focusing on getting the first world to commit to technology transfer in a way which is fair, is not prejudiced against the developing world. I think there must be a push to really developing Africa's ability to move towards a new kind of economy, which is not based on the old industrial food system, which has got us into this problem with climate change in the first place. We need to be going towards a situation where biodiversity is as important as food production. Those ecosystems that Dr. Manang mentioned, that's the way to go. And I think if the first world needs to accept that Africa and other countries need to develop, but we can develop in a way which doesn't harm the world. And if they can assist us in that, then that would be great. And then African countries also need to bite the bullet and start moving away from fossil fuels. And I think if we can do that, then there is hope. I don't think African people are not able to adapt. They've been dealing with some very dire circumstances up to now already. If we can give them the tools and the skills and free up the system to allow inter-African trade to take off and local produce to be bought locally, then I think we can survive. And we can actually grow and develop our continent.
We're going to leave it there for the moment, and that's all we have time for this week, I'm afraid. To my guests, Dr. Richard Monang in Nairobi, Steve Collins in Johannesburg, and Professor Ho Wenping in Beijing. Thank you all for your insights. Remember to join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.